It was so funny. We were somewhere, it was crowded. And people were coming through, I don't remember names, but when one lady came through with her bag, I was like, oh, I remember when you came through the line about 20 minutes ago. I recognize your bag. Huh? Exactly.
Yeah.
Shoes and bags.
Looks like it is 7 o'clock, and since we have a quorum, I would like to call the May 17th special meeting of the Rolesville Town Planning Board to order. Welcome, everybody. We're on the last few steps towards a pretty significant accomplishment. Thank you, everybody, for coming. First item on the evening is the Pledge of Allegiance. I would ask everybody to stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now for the invocation. Mr. Pierce, I hate to call on you cold, but if you could do us the honor this time.
Let us pray. Our Father, we're thankful to be here tonight. We're thankful for this day that you have given us, and we ask that you be with each of us as we conduct the town's business tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Next item up is the introduction of our new planning director. Welcome. It is good to see you in person.
Yeah, thank you. I think my voice probably will carry just fine on the microphone, but I think it'll be all right. So I just want to do a quick introduction. I'm Jason Brown. I'm the new planning director for the town. I have my background, I have a bachelor's of urban and regional planning from East Carolina University. So we got some Wolfpack folks in the crowd, so don't hold that against me. And also have a master's of business administration from ECU as well. I spent the last 6.5-ish years working with the town of Knightdale, first as a senior planner long range, running the long range planning and economic development division, and then the last 2.5 years as the assistant development services director. So that's what I've been doing. I was with the town of Garnerville for that and the town of Wilson prior to that. So I've been in North Carolina local government my entire career. Very humbled to serve here in Rolesville and excited to be here. And really just want to thank you guys for your service to the town. True citizen planners as the planning board. It's a really important role, a really important partner in the development process. And so just thank you for your service, and I look forward to continuing to work with you over the years. So happy to be here, and feel free to reach out to me anytime you have questions or need anything.
Thank you. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Next up are the minutes from the April, slight correction. Approval of, I guess, our portion of the minutes from the joint meeting with the town board, the virtual work session that we had on April 22nd. If there are no corrections, the floor is open for a motion.
I move the minutes be approved.
We have a motion for approval. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a second. All those in favor of approval, please signify with an aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Now on to the minutes from our last regular meeting on April 26th. The floor is open for any corrections or motions.
Hearing no corrections, I make a motion the minutes be approved.
We have a motion for approval with no corrections. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Once again, all those in favor of approval, please signify with an aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are passed. Thank you. On to the meat of this evening's special meeting. Case UDO TA 21-04, the Land Development Ordinance. Julie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So if you haven't heard by now, we are doing a land development ordinance update, rewrite. We are in the final stretches. Tonight's meeting is a special called meeting so that we have time to go over everything that we need to do for the LDO. If you are comfortable making a recommendation tonight, we can do that. If we don't get through all the slides and you would like to recess and continue the meeting, and not recess, but just continue the meeting until the 24th. We can do that as well. That way you have time to go over. So we've reserved the 24th as a continuation of this meeting tonight. So I don't want you to feel rushed in making any decisions. We have our consultants ready on Zoom to do the presentation. During the presentation, if you have any questions, just please go ahead and pipe in like we always do. Just raise your hand so I can make sure that they can see you, because they have a bird's eye view of the room, so they might not understand who's talking, or so just let us know, wave your hand and say your name. That way they know who to address. But we're going to go through the presentation. We're splitting it up between Kelly and James. They're going to tag team the presentation, and then I'll be here to help with any other questions that we have on the floor as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly, who you've met several times, but this is Kelly Klepper from Kimley Horn, and he will be going through the first couple of slides with us. Kelly, it's yours.
Good evening, everybody. Hopefully everybody is doing well, and make sure that you can hear me okay, Julie?
And we can.
Perfect. So as Julie said, we wanted to make sure that if you've got any questions along the way, please just let us know, and we'll be happy to try to answer those. We want to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the LDO as it's being developed and is being presented tonight. As Julie will tell you, there's a lot of work that has been going on behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and everything in between. This project would not be possible to the point we are without the guidance and the assistance and the teamwork of Julie. So, I mean, kudos to her. This has been a Herculean effort, to say the least. But so yeah, what we're going to do is kind of walk through. We've got, like I said, a series of slides we're going to talk through. We will go into as much detail as you need, or we will go through as little detail as you need. So just to kind of start off, and Julian, I apologize, kind of hard to see what screen that we're on, so I'm just going to assume that right now you're on the agenda.
I am.
Okay, perfect. So, what we're going to do tonight is talk, as Julie said, we're going to review the entire LDO, which includes the April 26th recap items. And then we're going to ask for, if we get through to that point, the recommendation to the BOC. Now, along the way, of course, what we want to make sure and talk about is the significance of the LDO. And of course, that is the Land Development Ordinance. Part of this discussion tonight is going to be talking about that. We're going to also walk you through a little bit of I'll say some of the changes, the references to 160D, the state standards. Also making sure that we have the steering committee's input, and want to make sure to recognize those folks as well. And I know there's several of you from the planning board that have been in the trenches. So like I said, some of this may seem old hat to you. And there again, this has been a monumental effort, to say the least. So thank you to everybody. So next slide, Julie. So what is the significance of the LDO? Well, when you go to the next slide, you'll start to see that, the LDO is the implementation of the town's comprehensive plan. It's also the implementation in the linkage back to the community transportation plan. So, we've got these two overarching visions that the town has, both from an overall land use and I'll say the big picture item as far as the umbrella, and then a little bit more of a micro view from the transportation plan. So how does all of that get implemented? It gets implemented through the Land Development Ordinance. As we've kind of talked about, and you all have seen this slide a couple of times, it implements those plans. Our task was to simplify and clarify, to create and update the rules and regulations to address the growth and redevelopment. And as Mr. Arnold will say, is this UDO or LDO, needs to be Rolesvillian. So how much input have we had over the course of this workshop or in the series of the LDOs? Julie, let's go ahead and go to the steering committee slide. And as you can see, we've actually had a number of meetings, 7 meetings to date. that, back in October 29, we started with specific sections, and we have worked our way through to March 18th. Each one of these topics was addressed as part of the steering committee review, changes along the way, so that as we started having our joint workshops with the planning board and the BOC, there was, some semblance of an effective strategy, as well as trying to vet out a lot of the questions and comments or concerns that were being brought up by the steering committee. So, there was quite a bit of effort there. Again, there was members of this body that were there, as well as the BOC, plus also our local private citizens. So, Jill, if we can go to the next slide, what is the proposed LDO? Oh, I see Julie's face.
Sorry, I'm trying to get it to,
Oh, okay,
help you?
perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Julie. So right now you have an existing UDO, Unified Development Ordinance. There are 16 sections or chapters of the current UDO and everything that you can see on your screen there. And one of the things that we started looking at early on in the process, including back as far as our interview, was can we look at consolidating or incorporating certain elements within certain components? And what we came up with, which is actually on the next slide, is the recommended layout that we did for the LDO. And so you can see we took the 16 sections that we had previously. We have consolidated those into 11 sections. We've actually put all the design and development standards, such as parking, signs, and things of that nature, under one specific section of the LDO. And then we also have two appendices. One's the LDO handbook, and that's kind of the how-to guide and what we'll say some of the more administrative functions that you typically find within an LDO, and put those in the appendix, along with Appendix B, which we will definitely be talking about tonight, the flood and the stormwater section. So Julie, our next slide. So what are those major changes? Of course, just very simply, it was an organization and readability. We updated and provided a number of graphics to tie to those standards. We created a series of mixed-use districts, one of which is actually mapped, being the town center. The others are floating districts that can be applied for based off of your comprehensive plan, but they're not automatically assigned as part of this exercise. We also did a clarification of the greenways. We provided standards with respect to conservation and preservation. We also, of course, went through with Dave Neal's significant assistance in looking at the 160D compliance components, and also looked at updating some of your development standards to bring those in line with current best practices. So from a 160D perspective, and I'm just going to briefly go through these, Julie, on the next two slides. So, 160D was adopted, but then it was extended, thanks in large part to COVID. So, the LDOs or UDOs are required to be updated by July the 1st of 2021. If not, don't worry, there's no penalty, but there is basically you come under the control of 160D until such time as the town adopts a new LDO. And you can kind of see the components of that. So 160D broadened the permit choice regulations. It created a series of consistent definitions. It also required the written property owner's consent for downzoning. If you go to the next slide, Julie, it also eliminated and combined certain things from a conditional use and a special use district. It also specifically permitted that you may use a form-based code. That's what FBC stands for. And then it kind of works through the rest of these items, including the length of time that can be applied to certain types of permits. Now, one of the things that I'll tell you is under our hybrid code, or our town center and activity centers, those mixed use areas, they're more of a hybrid. They're not necessarily a true form-based code. So we wanted to kind of keep some, I'll say 1 foot in each of the areas of a traditional code versus a form-based code. Hence the reason we came up with the term, the mixed use code, and it applies certain standards to each of those. So just kind of walking through, and we're going to walk through each of the sections. So let's go ahead and go to the next couple of slides, Julie. So section 1. This is just our baseline introduction. This is where we're introducing what the authority is for the town, the purpose and intent of the LDO, applicability, consistency with the comprehensive plan, and also severability. And basically what we put in that is that, if the courts for some reason find that one or more portions of the LDO are not sufficient or there's a conflict, then those portions will be, of course, brought out and not the entire LDO. So once you start kind of seeing that, this is just kind of that general 30,000 foot level of who it is, what it is, and what it has to be consistent with. The next slide actually also starts to establish, what is the authority and the intent of the LDO, what is the effective area, and also it calls out for the official zoning map. So there again, this is very much an administrative or introductory section. Some of the introductory components are also found within the LDO appendix, but we'll actually go through those towards the end of the presentation. So this is just kind of, I'll say, the run-of-the-mill components. There's not a lot of discussion or change that goes on with that, more clarification at this point. And it kind of sets the stage for where we go with our next couple of sections. So what are those next sections? Who are the review bodies? And basically, this section starts to identify and outline the review and the decision-making bodies, who they are, what they do, their processes. And then this also gets into the issue and the topic of vested rights. So when we start thinking about the review bodies that we have, there, of course, are the Board of Commissioners, the Planning Board, the Board of Adjustments, the Town Manager, the Technical Review Committee, sometimes referred to as the TRC, and the Land Development Administrator, the LDA. And all of this links back to, like it says right here, to the LDO handbook. Now, some of these terms you may be thinking about, okay, why did we do certain things? A lot of these were laid out when Danny was here, working through those aspects of things. So, we've tried to keep as current as we could, just because a lot of the steering committee members had seen those types of terms used throughout. Let me ask a question. And there again, those first two sections are fairly typical. There's, like I said, not a lot of fluff or anything else at this point. But there, I just want to remind everybody, if you do have questions, especially as we start to get into section 3 with the zoning districts, to please let us know. And Julie, if you can help there again with if somebody has a question, just interrupt us. So let's go into the zoning districts. So we have a series of, I'll say, the broad-based group categories: residential districts, non-residential districts, our conditional districts, the mixed-use districts like that we were talking about just a minute ago, including the town center, and then our inactive districts. And you may be asking yourself, why do we have inactive districts? Because some of the town's current standards or districts may be tied to a specific type of development, or they may be, we'll say, kind of vestiges of previous applications. So instead of getting rid of those altogether, it retains a reference that those districts are still, they are inactive. However, there are certain standards that you want to carry through for reference purposes. So that kind of gets you through to the specific zoning districts that we're talking about right here, and very similar to what we just talked about, the res, the non-res, conditional, all the way through. And this also contains, this section does all of the development standards for each of our zoning districts. So what we did is we took the current zoning districts that the town has, modified some of those, we consolidated some of those as well. And as you'll start to see on the next series of slides, and as you'll see in the LDO, what we did was to create a series of tables. And Julie, if we can go to the next slide. All of the districts are now formatted like this, so it's a simple, easy to read table with a series, we'll say information along the left, the standards are on the right-hand side of the column. And this starts to get into, like I said, this first one is the residential low. And James, if I say something incorrect, please correct me. But what we did is basically to consolidate a series of your lowest density districts here. Now, one of the things that you'll see is we got away from where we had R and a number, and which typically was dealing with, it was saying residential with a minimum lot size. Instead of trying to do something along those lines, we just said, let's just call it what it is. It's a low density residential. Here are the standards. And in this case, these are 2 dwelling units an acre. There is a series of standards that goes with this, including our setbacks. It does allow for a cluster subdivision with 40% open space, and that is some information that was basically brought up and identified during the joint workshops as well as the steering committee. And this is a district specific to single-family detached dwellings. And there again, like it says, this takes the place of the R1 district that the town currently has in play now. Julie, if we can go to the RM. So the REM is our residential medium. That's the next step up. It has a maximum of 3 dwelling units by right. If we do a cluster subdivision, which keep in mind clusters are 100% optional, they are eligible for a density increase up to a maximum of 5 dwelling units. We still have our 40% open space. And this one also takes the place of the R2 district. Now, a key component that came out of the steering committee and also the joint workshop was that the townhouses that were previously identified have been removed. So this one does not have a provision for townhomes at this point. So Julie, if we can go to the residential high, and now what you'll start to see is up to a maximum of 6 dwelling units per acre, primarily with a single family detached. Then you start to see that there's a tiered effect. So there's single family detached, there's attached residential, and then there's multifamily, each one with a little different application of a density standard. But then, probably the biggest thing that we had put input into the code itself was that no more than 15 gross acres may be assigned to attached or multifamily uses. As you all recall, that there was quite a bit of discussion about, we wanted to make sure that there was a variety of housing types within this, so that this way, by doing that maximum percentage, we're ensuring that it's not going to be one housing type. It can't all just be apartments. There has to be single family and apartments, or townhouses and apartments. So at the end of the day, there again, it's got to be a variation of the housing types. And each of the standards that you see there has been developed in using the single family, the attached, and the multifamily. The manufactured home district, there are special standards, like this says, for mobile home parks. And this does provide for a maximum of 2 units per acre at the end of the day. So very much similar and consistent with what you've seen in the past. So then we get into our first of our non-residential, so our general commercial. And this is probably one of the more widespread or broadest types of commercial districts that you have within the town. It does have design standards for commercial buildings, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, but there's specific standards that we've developed consistent with what the town had initially identified with some of your masonry ordinances. I know we had a pretty vibrant discussion on that at our last workshop, but we wanted to make sure that there were standards addressing commercial buildings, and consistent with one of what the commission members had asked for was a clarification on where do those standards apply, especially as we're talking about masonry. But we of course have expanded those to start looking at some of our transparency, some of our building heights, some of the I'll say architectural components that go along with that. Pretty consistent set of design standards that goes with that. And they're again, very much consistent with what we previously had from a commercial standpoint. Commercial highway, the CH district, this is an even more of a broad range of commercial uses. It does allow for increased building heights to accommodate and allow for hotels and similar types of uses that typically need to have a little bit more height in order for, I'll say, the performance of the development program to work. Now there again, anywhere that we have a maximum height above 35 feet, there is a requirement consistent with the town previous ordinances that the building has to be sprinkled. There was a fire safety issue that was identified early on. That's the reason you see a lot of the building heights are maximum of 35 feet. And there are allowances or provisions that you can go to 60 within certain areas. So this would be there again along your commercial highways, those areas where you see more auto-centric types of uses, and what you would see, we'll say, along most of your suburban and urban corridors. So another one of our non-residential districts is our office and professional district, the OP. And this is geared to be specifically for, like it says here, a wide range of office and medical uses. So your doctors, your attorneys, your personal and professional services, those types of uses that we can almost use as like a transition between our residential and our commercial, because they typically have, we'll say, less of an impact or a footprint in the community, and can really, like I said, kind of serve as a transition to those areas. Not necessarily having to be right in the downtown, can typically be, we'll say, off of an arterial or a collector road, but could also be kind of on the fringe of a neighborhood. So you can see those maximum of 35 feet with the setbacks. And we also get into some of our other types of standards there that you see, whether it's the setbacks. And of course, we also do get into a compatibility discussion as well. Our next district is the Business, Industrial, and Technology, or the BT district. This is a brand new district that we've identified and proposed as part of the LDO update. The intent was not to have just a general industrial, which we'll talk about in just a second, but this was more geared at a wide range, like it says right here, of light industrial, research, and business parks types of uses. This one also does have an additional height allowance, providing the buildings are sprinkled. This one actually is another one of the floating districts. It's not identified at this point. However, it is available to be implemented via a zoning map amendment. This would be very similar to what you would see within the rest of the research triangle area of this portion of the Carolinas. So it's not just industrial, but it's, we'll say, the industrial with the business technology. It's also some limited types of research and things of that nature. There again, we're trying to create almost like an employment type of district here. And then last but not least, the general industrial. This is what you would be considering more of your conventional industrial, wide range of light industrial, logistic types of uses, warehouse distribution, factories, manufacturing, things of that nature. This one also does allow for 60 feet for a maximum height, providing that it's sprinkled. And there also are some additional allowances or provisions where we start getting especially adjacent to residential or some of our, we'll say, office and some of our other non-residential uses. So let me ask if there's any questions on what we call the traditional zoning districts at this point before we move into the mixed use.
Kelly, I don't
Okay.
see any questions.
Okay, let's keep going for the mixed use. So 3 mixed use districts have been identified. The town center, which of course this group as well as the Board of Commissioners have already previously adopted. And that's been mapped and identified in the cities, we'll call it, just like I said, the town center, the downtown area. 2 floating districts at this point, or 2 that have not been identified on the map but would be eligible to be placed via a zoning map amendment, are the Mixed Use Activity Center and the Mixed Use Neighborhood Center. And we'll go through these in very quick succession here. So the town center, like there again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this was vetted pretty extensively back at the end of last year and the first part of this year. This has a maximum of dwelling units. It also gets into the maximum percent of approved residential units that can be constructed prior to the non-residential being built. And so we kind of use this as the model going forward because we heard very loud and clear that the planning board and the BOC liked this type of approach, especially from a mixed use perspective. So when we go to the activity center, the AC district, this is the more intensive of the activity centers. This is intended to be, we'll say, at the intersection of 2 major thoroughfares. As you may have additional arterial roadways coming together, this would be those areas where you want to still encourage, like I said, a wide variety of uses, but not necessarily just a straight up commercial use. So in this case, it does allow for residential as well as the non-residential. And like the town center, it also has a percentage of residential units that have to be approved and developed and constructed prior to the non-residential. And the primary reason for doing that is so that the entirety of the residential doesn't all get built, and then the commercial is languishing at the end of the project, and then everybody starts to wonder, well, when's this going to be built? So the town wanted to have some sort of trigger in there. This also has a minimum of a percent of non-residential uses, and you can see the standards there. You can go up to 60 feet. This is another one of those areas where we're trying to encourage a mixture of uses, not necessarily all walkable. They're still, of course, auto-centric. But there is the ability to have walkable environments to be interconnected, multimodal. And then the step down would be our neighborhood center. So we've got standards in there with respect to the maximum amount of dwelling units, similar type of trigger as it relates to the res to non-residential development. Does have a certain percentage of non-residential that's required. And just like you saw in the previous, it does have some additional standards with respect to the building heights, as well as what we call some of our building placement components. And you'll see within our activity centers, there's minimum and maximums. So the intent there is that we do not have we'll say a sea of parking between the roadway and the building. We want to have some semblance of the buildings a little bit closer, but not necessarily right up on the roadway itself. So we have designed some flexibility in with all of this. And, keeping in mind that one size does not fit all, there are opportunities for applicants to come through and ask for modifications to a certain type of standards. And that process is actually spelled out throughout the LDO as well as our handbook. Any questions on the mixed use districts?
I'm seeing no questions, Kelly.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over to James and give my voice a rest for a second.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. For the record, James Ehrman, Kinley Horn Associates. Happy to be here today, everyone. The next section we wanted to get into was the overlay section, section 4. So this comes right after the zoning districts. We thought it made sense to kind of have those close together in the new updated organization of the LDO. So as you go to the next slide, you'll see there's 2 overlays there. Section 4.1 covers the special highway overlay district for the US 401 bypass. And then we also include the watershed overlay there as well. And Julie, we can jump to the next slide. And pretty much what these 2 sections do is they do establish those overlays within the town. They are included on the zoning map, so it's clear to see. And they do have some unique different standards for development types, setbacks, things like that, that are just very particular to those 2 particular overlay areas in the town. And I think we can go ahead and jump into the next section then, Julie, which would be uses. And this is actually a pretty big part of the section here. If anyone remembers reading through this, this is a pretty long section. There's a lot of different stuff going on in here, including the principal uses, which we go ahead and actually define those uses in the code and combine them into use categories. So things like residential uses, non-residential. This is where we define, what a particular use is and isn't. We also include in this section 5.2, which is the accessory uses, structures, home occupations, things like that that aren't necessarily a principal use, but we want to make sure that we're covering and providing those basic standards in the code. We also do include the miscellaneous uses and structures in 5.3, as well as the temporary uses and structures in 5.4. So there are some particular examples here, and we just wanted to bring these up again. So Julie, you can go to that next slide, previous policy input uses. Some of these kind of not necessarily hot button issues, but just some issues that we heard loud and clear from the planning board and the BOC included to allow upper story residential in the OP district. So that's gone ahead and made that change in the code. Electronic gaming was brought up, and we've gone ahead and coded that appropriately within the code. Adult businesses was also brought up, and that's been kind of included in terms of where it can be located and the distance requirements between those businesses. So we followed through with the input policy from that. And as well as tattoo, and we got rid of the term parlor, if anyone remembers that fun conversation, tattoo parlor. It's now referred to as a tattoo establishment, and that's permitted in the districts that you see on the screen there. So we wanted to make sure we made those changes and caught those particular policy issues. Julie, we can go ahead to the next slide. Another particular use that we heard a lot about from the boards was temporary use for temporary sales and construction trailers. So after our last discussion, we wanted to make sure that we updated those. Really, they're not intended to be parked in the street, really meant to be more on site. We're limiting those to 2 trailers on site during some sort of active phase of development. So they have to kind of move those as the development moves, but do allow up to 2. And also prohibit things like tractor trailer, storage pods, shipping cargo containers as permanent storage, but they can be used on site during active construction phases, obviously, to protect the equipment on site, protect the materials on site, make sure people aren't coming up stealing things and sorts of that nature. So we allow those to be used in a temporary nature at this point in the code. And Julie, we can jump to the next one. And I know we had a lot of discussion on this one, and food trucks, everyone wants them. They're a great thing to go out and have a bite to eat. But, it's certainly something that's problematic sometimes for cities and towns to handle. So we heard a lot of different input, and we really liked where we settled up on this tiered approach for a 24-hour permit, a 1 location permit, and a multiple location permit. And we thought that was a really good idea, just a very dynamic way to deal with it, right? We have a lot of different options for different scenarios. And so those will have a slightly different fee for each permit tier, depending on the complexity of staff's review time. And they still all require some sort of site plan just to show where those are going to be on site. And there's also some standards built in there, such as how far they can be from the main entrance to a restaurant, as well as, we want to encourage those special events where there might be more than one food truck. So we allow those things as well in the food truck section of the code there. So we were pretty happy where that landed up, and there was definitely a lot of good input that we received back from the boards. Great, Kelly. And we can jump to the next screen there, Julie, for the use table. And we just wanted to show the example of kind of that finalized look for the use table. Very clean, very easy to tell where those uses are permitted under the districts, and where they're not permitted, we added that kind of dashed line saying, nope, nothing there. And just reads very clean, very easy on the eyes. And I know we went through a couple different iterations of that to try to come up with something that was catching to the eye, easy to use, and contained a lot of information at once without overloading everyone's eyes. So we were happy with that. And then I know we can jump into the next section unless there's any questions there. I know we ran through some of those uses pretty quick.
James, I don't think anybody has questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have a quick question.
Okay, Michelle has a question.
Yeah, hey, Michelle.
I may have forgotten this part, but going back to the trailers on site, I don't recall the tractor trailers. I know there was a question about storing equipment and material, but I don't remember being a tractor trailer. I thought we were referring to more or less like those single trailers on
The
site.
shipping containers, the storage pods, the tractor trailers are sometimes, they have the shipping container still attached to them. So that is what we're prohibiting. So it's not prohibiting as a permanent storage. They can be used temporarily,
Right.
but not as permanent storage. So they're prohibited as permanent.
I just don't remember that being discussed specifically.
Okay.
I have a question as well.
Okay, Davian?
This may have been for a different topic, but parking, is that something else?
Yeah, parking's going to come later.
All right. Okay, I'll hold my comment then.
Okay. Any other questions? Nope. All right, James, we're going to move back into section 6.
Great. And I know parking is coming right up, and I'm going to hand the baton back over to Kelly, and that'll be in a few slides here. So thanks, Kelly.
Okay. So section 6, this is where we took a lot of what you had identified in previous sections as far as either parking or signage and had those called out individually. What we did is we put all of the development standards together under one broad-based heading. So as you can see on the screen there, there's everything from signs to the open space, buffering, compatibility. Actually, we created a pretty large section with 6.2, but it's all kind of dealing with the compatibility, the landscaping, and the trees. We do get into conservation subdivision development standards, and that's part of what we were just talking about earlier with a couple of our districts. Mr. Cross, like you were asking, parking and loading is identified in section 6.4. Fences, walls, and berms, lighting, complete streets, and then the design standards. And those design standards are those items that we were starting to highlight as part of the commercial and or the industrial standards. So Julie, if we can go to this first section, that's on signage. So similar to what we did with the use table was to actually identify all the different types of signs that you can have and what districts they can be in. Now, the one thing that you'll notice is you don't see anything that says like real estate signs or governmental signs, other than, we do have a section in there on the traffic control devices, but, specifically avoiding those types of things that were content-based. And this is something that, Mr. Neal was very instrumental in helping us just kind of conform to a couple of things, especially as it relates to the town's interpretation. So there again, we've identified what types of signs you can have and where those types of signs can be placed within the respective districts, trying to keep that clean approach to the standards. And then similar to what we've identified with some of our other components, if we go to the next slide, Julie, you'll start to see where we identified and provided the graphics that start to lay out what type of sign it is, how those are used in a typical setting. And we'll actually show you in just a second, but what our biggest thing was we wanted to make sure to update the sign code, looking at consistent sizes, placement, making sure that we remove those extra regulations that were no longer needed or extraneous. But the biggest thing was just making sure that it's very easily understood and clear. So if you start to go to the next slide, Julie, there you go. Each of these is identified as a different type of sign, and similar to what we've identified and shown you previously. You know, if it's a monument sign versus a window sign versus a wall sign or a projecting sign, each of those has its own subsection with a series of standards. So you'll always see an illustration of what it looks like and how we measure certain things, and then also how those get applied in a contextual setting. From there, again, we do have the specifics as far as the sign placement, the height, the amount of square footage that you can have within each of those signs. And there again, that's for every type of sign that we've identified. And Julie, now, especially since we're getting into these design development standards, if we need to, just please let me know if we need to stop and talk about a specific section, or otherwise I'm just going to keep going, okay?
Yep.
I do have another question.
Okay.
Okay, hang on just a second, Kelly. Michelle has a question.
So the
Yes, ma'am.
signage here is referencing commercial signs, right? Not your ordinary election-day sign or,
It's, yeah,
Restaurant
it does not
signs.
include governmental signs, and it does not include your real estate signs, but any other business signs, it does include. So yes, for restaurants, because they are a business. That's commercial.
okay.
Quick question on signs. So those temporary vinyl signs for our new business that's just coming in, are those also included?
Like the banner type signs?
Correct.
Yes,
Vinyl?
temporary banners are included in the standards, yes.
Good.
All
Two
right,
really good questions.
I hear no other questions.
Okay. And just so everybody knows, you know, we do identify the maximum number of signs that are permitted per business or per property. We also get into the maintenance standards. We also get into the construction and like Julie was just confirming, you know, the temporary signs as well as some of our, like I said, what happens with signs within rights of ways. So all of those are identified within section 6.1. We also do get into a delineation between painted art / murals, and that's in a portion of the sign code. It's actually 6.1.2, because I know there's been some discussion by this body as well as some of the others as far as how do we treat murals, especially if they're of a non-commercial or advertising nature. So we wanted to make sure that there was a delineation between those moving forward.
I'm sorry, I just got one question.
Renata has a question.
Thank you. For the signage, so is that inclusive of like neighborhood signs as well? I just didn't understand, was it just for like a business or, you know, the different
It
businesses? or
includes, yeah,
the
any
neighborhood?
signage, so it includes your monument signs for when you're going into a subdivision, that type of thing. It also includes your temporary signage for yard sales or something like
That was
that.
gonna be
And,
my
you know, yeah, any of your temporary signs that you'd have out. And then what it does not cover is your election signs. That's covered underneath the state code. And then it doesn't cover like your political government signs and the real estate signs. And the real estate signs are covered underneath another state code as well.
Okay. Do you mind just going back a few slides to the one where it talked about permitted and not permitted? Yeah, so I was trying to figure out because I see the building sign and then it has ground signs. Is that where you're discussing like a sidewalk sign would be like a
Sidewalk signs like an A-frame, like a sandwich board, like a menu board type
okay.
sign. Your window sign is going to be placed on the window itself. For the ground signs, your monument sign is the bigger, like here's an example, your monument sign, the top left corner. That's a monument sign where you have your columns and then your sign in the middle. And there are some subdivisions who have that same type going into the subdivision. It's a monument sign, whether it's for residential or whether it's for commercial. So the type of sign is really what we're talking about, not necessarily whether it's for commercial or industrial. It's the type of sign.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So this will discuss how far from the sidewalk, how far. Okay.
So one question just come up as Ms. Pryor was talking, what about existing business signs? If they move out of a business and their sign is currently are they grandfathered in on that business, or where do we
Yeah,
stand
so
on this?
what's going to happen with the nonconformities, we do have a section on nonconformities. So if there's currently something that we accidentally make a nonconformity that's existing, they can continue to exist. And then a new business could come in and change the sign face, but not the sign type. So if they wanted to redo the sign, they would have to redo it to the current day specifications.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, just a clarification. So if a new business comes in, you said they can't switch from like a tenant signage, like in the first box to
To a
the
monument
box.
sign.
They cannot do that.
Right. They would
Okay.
have to, if they do that, they have to then go to the standards that are on today's books. So they would have to not keep the grandfather clause, but they would go into the more recent code that we have written for those specifications to get their permit. Any other questions? All right, Kelly, I think we're ready.
Okay, so section 6.2, this is where we get into our open space buffering, landscaping, compatibility, and also our trees. This is one of those areas that we spent quite a bit of time with at the joint work session. So when you start looking at the open space, we've identified the amount of open space that's required for low and medium, as well as our residential high standards. And then also that there is still provisions for non-residential districts to have some forms of open space. Now you may start saying, okay, what is that comprised of? So we actually go into, as identified on the next slide, that there is a series of features, and we call out the different types of open space areas, whether it's a small, medium, or large type of feature, the typical acreage or the square footage of those, and then also what types of things that you would typically see within either an active or a passive component of a park. So you can see on the left, there is a list. On the right on the left are the active features that you would normally see as part of a open space. Passive features, including walking trails, boardwalks, picnic areas, things like that. Those are also identified. And we're not saying that these are the only items. You know, if somebody wants to be creative, then they of course have the ability to come in and meet with Julie and Jason and make a proposal as part of how they're going to apply that open space provision. From a buffering perspective, what we start to see is, we talked about that there are 4 buffer types ranging in the width and intensity, and there's also a chart that we provided, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that says, okay, if it's a type 1 buffer, or in this case, it is a type 3, then there's a minimum width and there's a minimum number of trees, shrubs, undergrowth that's required. If there is a wall placed, where does the wall have to be placed? And the key to a lot of this is making sure that, the wall is interior to the buffer itself. It's not the use that's right up against the road and then all the trees are on the inside of the development where the residents are. Basically, we're saying, from the exterior of the property or exterior of the road looking in, you're going to see the ground cover, the trees, and then the wall. And this doesn't prohibit somebody from doing something a little different. By all means, topography and existing features, whether it be utility easements, driveways, things like that, may preclude certain types of standards. So there is the flexibility built in there of how and where we start to place those trees. And it also calls out the minimum number of trees that are required within a 100-foot length. So Julie, if we go to the next one, you'll start to see there's that chart that identifies what are the specific widths, number of trees required for a 100-foot length, all the way through to is there a wall or a berm or anything else required at that point. And there again, we do allow for certain provisions and certain understandings, especially when we start talking about some of the topography and also the use of existing vegetation. From a compatibility standpoint, we built in some what we call the mitigation techniques to ensure compatibility. So, once you get beyond the traditional setbacks and or the buffer standards, then we're also starting to look at other things as it relates to the buildings themselves. If it's a residential against a non-res or commercial or even a mixed-use building, once we get above certain heights, then we start also looking at step backs or moving portions of the building further away from the property line. So we've identified some of those ideas and techniques to help ensure some of the compatibility that we have throughout the town. From a landscaping perspective, one of the things we heard loud and clear early on was that we wanted to require a variety of trees that are being proposed or planted on a specific site. One of the concerns we heard, and I can't remember who it was, but they were said, hey, so if we've got an entire area, a piece of property that's replanted, could they do all red oaks? And it was a really good question. It actually started making us think. It's like, no, actually, we want to make sure that there's a variety for a couple of different reasons. Drought tolerant versus certain species may be a little bit better suited. And also, heaven forbid, we start to get into a blight situation. So, you can see that we've broken out the percentages as far as the number of trees and the types, we'll say, that are required at that point. And we do provide a listing, a landscape listing. So the types of trees, whether they're large or, I'll say, a canopy type of tree versus an understory or a lower growth tree, we do provide that list so that everyone knows exactly what types of trees we're talking about. And then also as part of the landscaping, we do require, like it shows in the picture right there, landscape islands in the parking lots. We want to make sure that those areas are sufficiently sized to accommodate the proposed landscaping materials. And we're not proposing to put we'll say, a very large tree within a very small parking island, just because we know that those areas don't survive. So we want to do the context sensitive or right size the trees for the landscaping and the parking area itself. So then we get into tree preservation. And as James said, we had some quite a bit of policy input on this at our last workshop. And what we've done is to identify, the minimum percent of preservation of developments and the size of the property, so 2 acres or larger. We get into certain sizes, whether it's an evergreen or deciduous. And we also DBH, that diameter at the breast height, preserved. But then more importantly, there is flexibility in the replacement of trees, and it also allows for the removal of sick or dead trees. There was quite a bit of discussion by the group that what if a 60-inch tree is right in the middle of the site? Well, we wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for those trees to either be mitigated for or removed. It wasn't a zero-sum game at the end of the day as far as you could not touch the tree. So we wanted to make sure that there was flexibility in that. And we also identified provisions, James, correct me if I'm wrong, especially as it relates to the trees around the periphery and the buffer in the buffer areas. Okay, any questions on the trees?
Yeah. We have one from the audience.
Yes, we have a question from one of our citizens on that.
Okay.
Yes, is there any way possible that we can ban certain trees? And the purpose of my question is, as being on the board, we had to replace so many of the spruce because strong winds knock them down, and the replacements, when you put them in, it just take away from the whole development. But those trees are they're not a good tree to be in a development, I know, that's used as a buffer because we've had so many to get blown down by strong winds.
Kelly, I don't know if you heard the question.
Yeah, as far as banning certain types of trees just
Yes.
because they're either not hardy or they, may not be, able to withstand certain winds and environment. James, correct me if I'm wrong, we do have the specific list of trees identified within the LDO. I don't recall if there were where that was in specific section, James. I know because we just looked at that with Richard and our landscape architect partners. But yes, there are certain trees that are called out. There is a requirement that a landscape plan be provided so that, the town can have some say in the types of trees and where those are being installed. James, did you find that section?
Yeah, Kelly. Yeah, we do actually call out to the North Carolina Forest Service, and they have a list of plants and trees which are acceptable and not acceptable. And I do believe that the tree ordinance by the town as well also has a list, or it says that there needs to be a list of appropriate trees to plant throughout the town. So it may be something that if it's not completely specified or if it's not updated, that it may be something that the town does, post July 1st on that.
Thank you for that clarification, James.
Yep.
Any other questions, Julie?
I'm not seeing any, no.
Yeah, and that's actually not a question that we don't get quite a bit, especially I lived in East Tennessee, and we actually started going through and restricting Bradford pears for a lot of those reasons. So there's other types of pears, of course, that you can do. So, that's not unheard of for a community to ban certain types or restrict or prohibit certain types. So that's actually a really good consideration. Okay, section 6.3, conservation subdivisions. This is something that we had quite a bit of discussion on at the joint workshops. And I think we actually talked about it at both workshops, but this does allow for development on smaller lots in exchange for the conservation of certain amount of lands. And, this is not an increase in density per se. What we do is allow for the lot sizes to be reduced, and the trade-off is then that goes into a conservation easement that's recorded at that point. The priority in this case is preserving the natural features and environmentally sensitive lands, and it's also a cost savings measure for the development community because they're no longer having to build roads that go the entire length of the property. And some of the examples we showed, you could actually develop within, we'll say, the first 40 to 50% of the site. And that's going to be a significant cost savings, both from a roadway as well as a utility installation. So this is totally optional, but it is a tool that we wanted to make sure was out there. Parking. Now, we didn't get into a lot with respect to this, but we'll definitely be able to try to answer any questions you have. But in a similar type of approach that we've done with the signs as well as the uses, we've provided a minimum and a maximum number of parking spaces that are required for a use. We do get into the parking area design. And, probably one of the biggest things that we get into at this point is also provisions or allowances for shared parking, or more importantly, an alternative parking plan or an APP. So what we've tried to do is to right size the parking, minimize that sea of asphalt that we typically see. And, some businesses actually do this for, they will design their parking around 2 days out of the year, the day after Thanksgiving and the day after Christmas. And then the rest of the year, most of those parking spaces are not used. So what we're trying to do is right size the parking based on a number of standards. And this also gets into reductions in stormwater runoff, air and water quality, and some other types of provisions. There's also provisions in here that actually address some of the watershed components that the town has at this point. Now, there again, if a business or developer comes in and says, hey, I appreciate the fact that you have this standard, but we think that there is a different standard that needs to be applied, there is a process that they can go through, and that is done as part of a development application. And what they need to do is, in essence, to bring in a copy of a study or an analysis that shows why they need the number of parking spaces and what's the rational basis for that. And Mr. Cross, did you have a specific question on the parking?
No, I did not, actually. I just wanted to make sure that we covered it. Thank you.
Okay. I did not want to forget or bypass you on that.
Not a problem. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. So section 6.5, fences, walls, and berms. This looks very similar to what we just talked about with some of our landscaping and buffering standards. But this is where we're starting to get into the fences and walls and how they're being constructed, what types of materials, and also where they can be constructed. So this actually goes hand in hand with the previous section, but there again, this gets into more of the specific construction design and the materials that can be used as part of a fence or a wall with this as part of a development. Lighting.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
And just for clarification, I apologize. Was that for residential or for us also for commercial? Just so I'm
It's for anybody who's doing fences, walls, and berms. So it's a design standard for anybody putting in a fence or a wall or a berm and any type of perimeter buffer, regular buffer, or just in general.
Okay. And when it comes to residential, is that also go towards like homeowners association have to follow these regulations or?
Homeowners
just talking-
associations are usually more restrictive, so they follow their own guidelines. Their guidelines cannot conflict with ours, so they
Yeah.
can't be less restrictive, so they have to at least match ours.
That was my question. Thank you.
And Julie, just to make sure, because I know this question came up, there are exemptions, especially once we start talking about active construction sites, silt fencing used during construction, tree protection, swimming pool fences. That's actually a specific standard called out by the building code. And then we also start to identify those bona fide farm and agricultural activities as set forth by the general statutes. So there are exemptions to the standards based off of specific types of applications.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Julie. So let's talk about lighting. And what we're talking about here is street lighting, parking lot lighting, building lighting. We're not talking about individual lighting, like I said, that we'll say like the carriage lights for an individual house. But we are talking about, we'll say like the parking lot lighting at town hall. So what we're starting to do is to regulate not only the intensity, but basically the placement and the use of lighting structures and facilities on a particular piece of property. We'll say that fast 3 times. We do get into and establish the maximum height and require the parking lot lighting to be staggered, and we'll actually show you that in just a second. The other thing that we talk about is the regulation of the light, we'll say light pollution or also light spillage off of a site. So we do have standards built in on that. And as it relates to similar and keeping a similar consistent theme, we do provide a series of graphics that start to illustrate what is the maximum height of lighting both along the street or in the downtown setting, or when we get into a parking lot situation where, you know, like the image on the right, those the light fixtures are 30 feet tall, but as you go closer to the perimeter of the property, then those start to drop in height. And the purpose behind that is from a compatibility standpoint and to minimize the amount of light spillage coming off of a particular piece of property. We're by no means saying that that area is going to be any less safe. We're just saying it's more concentrated because you don't need to illuminate a larger area. It's very concentrated at that point. Any questions on lighting?
I got one question on that. So the lighting where you have a commercial against a residential, where do we stand? Are we going to say the 12 feet to 15 feet is a standard, or is that?
Yes, absolutely. We do get into those maximum heights. We do get into the light spillage, and James, correct me if I'm wrong, we do get into the foot candles, so the measurement of light at the periphery of the property. They've got to provide how much of that is going off, and there are standards that say you can only have X amount that comes off at what are these intervals and distances. We do also require that the manufacturers, what we call cut sheets or specifications, are required as part of a lighting plan. And we also identify where those lights need to be hooded or shielded, where they cannot be directly illuminating, we'll say, from a building directly onto a single family house. And we also there, again, we're talking about, we get into those heights, especially as we get further away from the building itself.
Okay, so I guess with the setbacks being 35 feet, the lighting should fall within the setback and not onto the personal residential property, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And one of the things that we did identify is to also require that, to avoid conflicts, because we see these quite a bit, that the parking lot lighting has to be coordinated with the parking lot landscaping, because what we end up seeing a lot of times is you'll get multiple sheets as part of a site plan. One sheet will show the lighting fixtures, but then the next sheet shows the actual trees. And unfortunately, those two are usually done by two different people as part of a site plan. and they may not correspond to each other. So we've actually seen where a light fixture and a red oak were actually to be installed on the same location. So we start to basically make sure to identify that there will be, those items have to be coordinated. Okay, Julie, we are on to section 6.7. And this is our complete street section, and I will say that this is very similar to some of our other standards, but as it relates to the CTP. But this is adopted by reference, and goes back to the just recently adopted community transportation plan, which calls out the different types of context areas, the land use description, and what those zoning districts are, and where the specific type of street should be utilized or installed. So you can see the different type of context areas, and those relate there again back to the CTP and the specific standards that have been identified as part of that. And then on to our next section, the last one for me for just a little bit, we're going to talk about design standards. And this is what we were talking about earlier with the non-residential design standards. So what types of buildings do we want to have in the town? And this is dealing with the non-residential, the commercial, as well as the industrial. So we do have a series of standards for both of those types of buildings. We do require that 60% brick materials for facades visible from rights of way. And that was quite a bit of discussion at the last joint workshop. We also provide for appropriate amount of transparency. So how much window or door needs to be along the building frontage. Now, there are a couple of things, and I will say these are purely optional because of the way the state standards are written, but we do provide for residential single family and multifamily component, but the single family are optional because that we cannot actually regulate certain things unless they are authorized or approved in consideration with the developer or the owner of the property. So there, we've got some standards, but those have to be bought into by both parties moving forward. So Julie, if we can go to the next slide, you'll start to see there again, we like using the images and the graphics. So we talk about the multiple materials for non-residential uses, like the image on the top. We start to call out how much of that should be windows, architectural features, the change in colors, the change in materials, and different types of components like that. The bottom left picture are industrial types of standards. So we still have some, but they're not near as intense. We do get into foundation plannings. We do get into still some of the change of plane and color, but they're not to the level nor the complexity of, we'll say, the commercial and some of the other standards. But at the end of the day, we want the buildings to look nice within the town. So that's the reason you see design standards all across the spectrum. And Julie, if we can go to the next one, that'll kind of give you an idea of what are all the standards that we identified within this section. Everything from the facades, the massing, transparency, blank walls is a big one, materials and colors, the location of parking, pedestrian standards, and also multi-building development standards. So what we're trying to accomplish there is that there is some semblance or uniformity between the buildings. Not that all the buildings have to look exactly alike, but they need to utilize similar types of features so it looks like that there is a common design and development theme. Julie, any questions before we move on to telecommunications?
I had one question going back into the conservation subdivision section.
Okay.
That's the same thing we had referred to as cluster at one point in time, is that correct?
Clusters and conservation are a little bit different.
Okay, they are?
Mhm.
Okay. So there's another cluster subdivision section?
Yeah, there's cluster is optional, and so is a conservation subdivision, but they allow for different types of developments.
Okay.
I think that was the only question.
Okay. James?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I'll go ahead and pick up the baton from here. So telecommunication actually is section 7. When we actually originally kind of plotted out section 7, it was we're going to do a few different special standards throughout the code. But as we kind of clean things up, we said, hey, It looks like it's just going to be telecommunication here, so let's just name it that. So a lot of telecommunication items and standards are actually preempted either by federal or state law. So really here, it's kind of key just to make sure that we're staying compliant with 160D rules and regulations. But we did hear some planning board input that they do want to allow some of the towers that you'll see for cell towers and whatnot as a possibility in districts through that special exception process. So it still does have to go through that extra level of town approval, which is always a good thing to have that extra set of eyes on some of those towers and whatnot. Although, having said that, we do see a lot of communities when these started to come out, 20, 30 years ago, it was a lot of pushback, but now a lot of them are just kind of settling in, and you don't even really notice them in a lot of portions of the country. But still a good idea to go through that special exception process. So we built that there. We do have some co-location standards established throughout that telecommunications section as well. And there are some state and federal laws regarding co-location standards. And that's essentially just things that rules and regulations that require new towers to also allow for other carriers to add antennas or equipment on those towers to co-locate their signals. Really, it's just an attempt to try to remove excess towers from going up throughout the town. You definitely don't want any more than you need. And there is some level of consultant review that the town does use for these telecommunication towers and co-locations. And so we've kept that consistent as we updated that section. The next section would be traffic impact. And this is another section that we've not changed too much on. The town does still utilize services of an on-call consultant hired or retained by the town to perform any type of required TIA. And really that cost is going to be moved to the applicant of the development. And these traffic impact studies are obviously very important. They are going to make sure that whenever a new development comes into town, we want to make sure that the roads and the road system can adequately carry those expected trips and generation amounts and that we see for new developments. So that is definitely a good portion of the code here that we wanted to include, provide its own section here, and really just make sure we have those standards built in very clearly, and it's really kind of behooves the town to use that consultant-based approach moving forward. It is a very technical aspect and very specialized skill set that a lot of different developers and consultants have to go through. So that we do feel that this is a very good, appropriate kind of set of standards here for traffic impact moving forward. And we'll move into section 9, subdivision regulations. And Kelly, I'll hand back over this one. I know you love this section in particular.
This is where I'll say your technical specifications are as it relates to the subdivision of land. There are definitely some introductory and legal provisions, like it says on our next slide, Julie. Section 9 is dealing with the subdivision of land. It gets into, I'll say, almost like our similar to our engineering standards for development. So it's everything from the streets and sidewalks to how long a block can be. What about the lot standards, easements, subdivision access, utilities, and refuse collection. Now, one of the things we want to make sure, this was something that we've worked very closely with staff on, and also in compliance with 160D. So, Jewel, if we go to our next slide, we do identify, of course, that there is the 160D compliance. We identify whether it's a major or a minor subdivision, the design standards for streets and sidewalks, and that's also consistent with your CTP. And then also there was quite a bit of discussion at the last workshop with respect to our sidewalks placed on both sides of the street, when and where they can be placed only on one side. And also a clarification that greenways shall not be constructed in place of sidewalks. I think the groups were very adamant in just making sure that it was very clear, especially with the pending Greenway master plan that the town is going to be pursuing here in short order. We wanted to make sure to keep definitely a separation between sidewalks and the Greenway provisions. One, because they serve a completely different function. So we wanted to make sure we have standards set up for all of those components, especially as it relates to the subdivisions and the subdivision of land and the lot standards. Okay. Non-conformities. James, definitely correct me if I say something wrong here, but this was pretty consistent with where we started with from the previous UDO, making sure that we're consistent with 160D as it relates to non-conforming structures, uses, and lots. and also starting to look at, some differences between non-conforming versus the conforming. And also, what is the effect of these amendments and amendments into those areas? So as we go to the next slide, we do make sure that it's very clear that there are certain allowances and regulations for the continued existence of non-conformities, those grandfather types of uses, because they have been legally established. There are certain standards you want to make sure, and certain uses. Of course, the last thing you want to do is get into a takings issue. So there are standards that have been identified as part of these of the LDO provisions moving forward. And then lastly, is the administrative definitions, or excuse me, the administration and the definitions. And this starts to get back into very similar to what we had originally identified in the initial portions of the LDO. But, if there's an interpretation, who makes the interpretation and how is that made? The use of images, what are the rules of measurement? What is the zoning map? And then more specifically, what are those definitions that we have that are not the use type definitions that we had back up in section 5. So there again, if there's a rule of measurement and interpretation, that's going to fall to staff and or the appropriate body, including any appeals of those interpretations. So Julie, I think it's kind of consistent with what we're talking about on the next slide. So there are, of course, the general administration provisions, the interpretation, and then again, the general definitions. And that gets into everything that, like I said, that is not defined as part of a use. So where we're talking about if it's a site triangle or, certain types of generally used definitions, those are all found in section 11. The use definitions where we're saying, if it's a drive-through or if it's a certain type of establishment, those are defined up in section 5.1. So there are, like I said, 2 sections for definitions. James?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And that really does get through the bulk of the sections of the actual LDO. And so what we're moving into next is actually the Appendix A, which is this LDO handbook that you've heard us reference before. And Julie, we can go ahead and jump into the next slide. And really what this LDO handbook intends to do, it is going to show some general provisions. And then what it does is really break down and define and include those processes for legislative hearings, evidentiary processes, and any sort of other administrative processes that some of the town employees might handle themselves. So if we go to the next slide, Julie, where we start to kind of get into this, like we said, really this is going to be the portion of the LDO in this appendix that really goes ahead and establishes the procedures for filing and processing applications. And it really is going to be a great tool for staff moving forward for the town of Rolesville to go and open it up, say, hey, this is really the process that we have laid out. This is where, this is the next step that we need to do for this particular process. And it is going to be designed, or it is designed at this point, to really allow users and the town employees alike to go ahead and use that to determine what are the next steps to really get those development approvals. How do I get from one permit to the next? And it really does lay all those steps out in great detail. So if we want to jump to the next slide, Julie. One of the examples here is we've provided a pretty encompassing, actually, review process table. And we've provided a couple clips of this. When you look at it together, it's actually one big table that makes it very easy to see who and what is deciding what that legislative process is, whether it's an annexation or a text amendment. Is it the LDA and the Land Development Administrator? They're looking at it and reviewing it, and that's where you'll see the R, where you see the double R, that's a review and a recommend, and that's under the planning board for those items. And then the D is actually who the final decision maker is, and that's going to fall under, for all the legislative processes, the Board of Commissioners, as they're the ones who can make those legislative process decisions. So we wanted to make sure we included that to show that very easily at a very quick kind of view without having to read through a whole lot of text to see who does what. This makes it a whole lot easier for developers and for citizens to understand the process and, to get more involved in the process. If you understand it more, there's more opportunities for public input and for everyone to be involved in that. You want to jump to the next slide, Julia? The next one's going to be really those evidentiary quasi-judicial approvals. And really, these are where there's some sort of level of discretionary standards in the LDO that have to be applied to an application. And we have to kind of go through those typical 160D level approvals of, does this meet the criteria of the code? Does this meet the criteria of 160D quasi-judicial procedures? And so here you can see these are a little different than what you saw above. These include appeals, special use permits, variances, vested rights certificates, and major subdivision preliminary plats. And here you can see there's a few different areas where those decision makers are different. The Board of Appeals actually, or the Board of Appeals, Board of Adjustment, goes through the appeals and the variance process, where the BOC has the ultimate decision on special use permits, vested rights, as well as major subdivision plats. And so we just wanted to show that. Provides a very easy to follow view. The next slide, Julie, would actually be some of the administrative permits. These are a little more extensive. There's a lot of different things such as zoning permits or building permits, construction permits. We didn't want to do too much detail at this point here because it really is mostly for review by the TRC and by the LDA and staff. And so what that does is really outlines all those different processes, includes all the different things that need to be met. And this is really those items where staff is going to have to go through the LDO, make sure those permits are meeting all the standards provided in the code before they can be approved administratively through staff. And there's a bunch of different ones there. And we've left it kind of open-ended too. So if staff, as they go through this and say, hey, we'd like to add a couple of new permit types, those will be easily added to this handbook as it's built out and as the town continues to grow. So we wanted to allow for that easy level of flexibility and change as well. And that takes us through the first appendix. Were there any questions on that?
I'm not seeing any questions, James.
Okay, great. We'll jump into the Appendix B, and that's the second and last appendix that we'll have in there. And really, this is a pretty technical appendix, I would say, Julie, and I know we worked closely with staff on this one. Really, there's only two sections of this, the flood damage prevention section, as well as the stormwater management section. And so really, these are going to be things that are very technical in nature. And we can jump to the next slide there, Julie. A lot of these are things that are lining up with state level model prevention ordinances and also trying to be consistent with Wake County and some of their regulations moving forward. I know that the town's going to have some future stuff coming down the pipeline for things like stormwater management and flood prevention techniques. Those are going to be continuing to change as they always do. It seems that there's always new techniques and new standards coming up in the pipeline for new rules and regulations. But we've tried to set this up so staff can very easily take this, make sure it's being definitely in accordance and compliance with everything going on right now. But also as these things change, that's why we thought it behooves us and the town to really include those in the appendix so they can be easily updated and changed, as time moves forward for those sections. And that takes us down to the zoning map, Kelly. I didn't know if you wanted to step in on this one or if you want me to continue to kind of set it up.
Yeah, well, James, let's just tag team on this one because I know there's been quite a bit of discussion back and forth working with Julie. And, just making sure that what was on the town's original zoning map is still being held intact for the most, when I say intact for the most part. We didn't go off the rails, and what was previously, we'll say, like one of your residential districts is now a commercial district. So we've literally gone painstaking property by property to ensure that, if it was residential, it's still residential, making sure that if it was a low density residential at the beginning of the process, that when it goes to the coloration on the map and the standards, that it's being identified in a consistent manner. So Julie, if we can go to that first slide, and this kind of gives you a reference of, the zoning map itself is adopted as part of the LDO. So what we're going to be asking for you tonight is, in addition to the LDO and the appendices, is to also make a recommendation, if you're so inclined, with respect to approval and adoption of the zoning map or approval of the zoning map. So we, as Julie will tell you, we've gone through the advertising process. We are retaining the zoning, just updating the names. So there again, if you were residential to begin with, you're still residential. It's just the names may have changed. So Julie, if we go to that next one, And I apologize, I know this is kind of difficult to see. These maps are much better either on a GIS format so you can zoom around or fly around on your computer, or when they're fairly large scale printed out so that you can see the specific roadways. But what you'll start to see is, there is quite a bit of residential in the town. And we know that this has been some level of discussion. So this is probably one of those things that after July the 1st, the town will probably want to revisit, especially as they're talking about the update to the comprehensive plan. There was quite a bit of discussion about can we allow the commercial within some of our residential areas. And there again, some of the discussions is kind of centered around, is it consistent with the comprehensive plan or not? So for the current time, we're proposing just to keep, like I say, if it's residential and those standards moving forward, consistent. At the end of the day, what we're proposing, it looks very similar, of course, with some differences in the names. But there again, looking at what is residential, what is the town center, our 3 floating districts, whether it's the BT district, that business industrial technology, our 2 remaining activity centers, mixed use areas, the activity center and the neighborhood center. So those, although they're identified by color and by reference on the map, they're currently not mapped. Those can only be identified as part of a subsequent zoning map amendment. James, what did I miss on the zoning map?
No, I think you explained it really well, Kelly. As you said, the intent here was really not to, to rock the boat, quote unquote. Really no major changes here. This really is just kind of a name change of the districts that we've updated throughout the LDO. So definitely not, no changes in zoning here that would affect any property owners. That was definitely the intent going through with staff on this process. So like you said, too, I know coming down the pipeline will be updates to the comprehensive plan, which at that point is often a really good time for a community to look at their zoning map and say, is this lining up with our future land uses? Is this kind of coming up with what we want to see in the future? And at that point, it's always a really good opportunity to revisit the zoning map, revisit the comprehensive plan, and kind of revisit some of those topics. So I think you summed that up really well, Kelly.
Julie, any questions from the planning board members on the zoning map?
I am not seeing any.
Okay. That concludes our presentation on the LDO.
We do have one question, hang on. So that's the special intensity allocation area for the watershed. We have so many acres that we can go for special intensity. That way they can go up to 70% in their development as stormwater instead of the 12% that they're restricted to. So they have to go through a special allocation process with the Board of Commissioners. And so anybody who has that allocation already handed out to them, we've marked on the map. That's something that was on the last map. We carried it over. And we have another question. Go ahead, sir.
What is the one development that have been converted into business now? What's the location of that?
Oh, we have no developments that we're rezoning as part of this time. So we are not converting anything from a residence to a commercial as part of this map. Any more questions? All right, Kelly, we're good. I'm going to move to the next slide.
So what happens now? Well, this is where you get a chance to tell us good, bad, or whatever at this point, make recommendations to the BOC. Of course, they do have a workshop tomorrow night. But as the planning board, you have the ability to make recommendations, comments, suggestions as it relates to the LDO, the zoning map, and moving everything forward. Of course, tomorrow's meeting with the board is only a workshop as it relates to the LDO. There's a formal adoption hearing currently scheduled for June the 1st. So there'll be a similar type of presentation and a formal ask for the adoption of the LDO at that point. With that, Julie, we are done with our presentation and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kelly and James. You did a great job.
Thank you.
You guys have any more questions for Kelly and James?
Not at this time.
All right. I'm seeing no more questions. So we're good if you want to hang out for a little bit, or if you want to sign off, you can go ahead and do that too.
We'll stick around.
Okay, that's good. Appreciate it. Thank you. So, Chair, it's back to you. And so we did, we kind of did the presentation for items 6 and 7 together, but the motions can be combined into one motion if you want to make a recommendation tonight. If you guys want to mull this over, have more questions, and continue the meeting on until next week where you make a recommendation, then we can do that as well.
What would the board like to do?
I'm good, so.
Yeah, I have no further recommendations. I've been a part of this journey for a while now.
Many
so-
months.
Yes, you
Many, many
evidently have
months.
been working on it.
So,
I mean, I'm fine myself. I didn't know if Board Member Schwartz had any input, if anybody had anything from him at all.
We have not heard from him.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure. I mean, I have no further questions myself.
Well,
I have no further questions at this time.
Give the mayor pro tem a chance.
Believe it or not, I have no questions at this time either. That's a miracle, right?
Yeah.
Different story tomorrow, I'm sure.
We did a good job then. All right.
I don't think we're supposed to agree with that. Yeah.
Well, if the board is ready, the floor is open for a motion.
So we're making a motion for both the acceptance of the
You can
rezoning
combine
and-
them if you want to, yep.
Okay,
Make it a little bit easier.
all right. So, no further questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll go ahead and make a motion.
Please do.
All right, I'd like to make a motion to recommend approval of UDO TA 21-04 to the Board of Commissioners. The Planning Board concludes the proposed amendment as reasonable and in the public interest because it brings the local ordinances into compliance with applicable North Carolina law. Additionally, the proposed ordinance amendment supports the following policies and goals in the town's adopted comprehensive plan, goals LU1, LU2, LU3, and LU5. I'd like to also add the rezoning amendments to be accepted as part of this motion.
That would be case MA 21-04, correct?
Sorry. Okay.
We have a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of forwarding TA 21-04 and MA 21-04 to the town board with a positive recommendation, please signify with an aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? The ayes have it. At this point, I want to thank everybody who has put in a lot of time and effort on this one, both in the work groups, town staff, and reviewers. Been a pretty big haul. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with us. We know that we've asked a lot over the last year between steering committees and workshops and the CTP and the LDO and all this happening all at once. We appreciate everybody being so attentive, doing the readings, asking the questions. It's been a good process. I've been really pleased to be a part of it, so thank you.
Thank you. You've done a good job.
Thank you.
Thanks.
On to more routine items. Item number 8 is Planning Director's report. Is the new Planning Director going to handle this one, or Julie taking it?
I don't have any additional report. We are in the process of recruiting for a planner 1 position, so coming in the next couple months, we'll have a new face to introduce you all to. Look forward to that. Our building permit numbers are up this year thus far, so looking pretty good there. We got several development proposals. Once we get past the LDO, that'll start moving forward to get some lots recorded, and I think you got that report in your packet, so feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions regarding that. But thank you all for your work on the LDO, certainly appreciate it, and big kudos to Julie for the big lift. I know it's been a lot of work and very time involved, but appreciate everybody's hard work on that.
Thank you. Item 9, Town Attorney's Report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I promised that I would bring this back to you. So last week was the crossover deadline at the General Assembly. There were over 90 bills introduced in the session this year relating to regulation of planning and development, primarily at the local government level. Of those, most of them did not make crossover, as you might guess. It's a severe filtering process. But there were about 8 bills that have come over, all of them passing in the House into the Senate, that I wanted to mention to you very quickly. First of all, the one that had been most watched, I think, around the state that didn't make crossover, before I give you the ones that did, was the townhome bill that would have permitted townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, and multifamily in all residentially zoned districts throughout the state. That was a bill that was watched and worried over quite a bit, but even though it was introduced in both houses independently, neither of those bills progressed. However, the House did pass a bill that would permit schools, private and public schools, as a permitted use by right in every zoning district in the state. There was a bill that made crossover that would outlaw tree preservation ordinances that regulate the removal of trees. That passed the House, and that's one that we'll certainly be watching after all the discussion we've had about tree preservation ordinances during the LDO process. There was a bill that passed, I believe, in both houses, and so it'll now just go to conference committee, that would eliminate the charging of fees by local government inspectors when they identify new inspection violations in a follow-up inspection. If they discover something new on the second or third inspection at your building site, they cannot charge you a fee for that, even though they can make you fix it. I keep saying and I hate doing that. Sorry about that. Restrictions on we've added to the LDO a lot of potential for conditional zonings. There would be very limited conditions that could be imposed upon any residential development in a conditional zoning case in the event the applicant is including affordable housing in the application. So if the applicant includes affordable housing for those earning less than 80% of the median wage, the limits are essentially things like height and density without any additional conditions that could be imposed. There is a bill that made crossover that the Senate will take up, considering whether to expand the current prohibition on the regulation of solar panels. That expansion would go beyond local governments being limited in what they can do. It would also eliminate private restrictions that we see in restrictive covenants and deeds. And finally, there was a commission established by there will be, if it passes the Senate, there will be a study commission established to take a look at the impact of local government regulation and exaction upon affordable housing in the state. That is something that has been being pushed by the Home Builders Association, both here and nationally. So these are all items that we'll continue to watch. And our new planning director will be bringing to you text amendments if any of them pass in his brand new LDO, or in Julie's LDO. It's not really Jason's yet, let's be honest. So that's all I have. Any questions?
That wasn't me, that was Jimmy.
Jimmy.
Hey,
Yep.
could you go back over the third from the last again about affordable homes and that area, the restrictions?
Right. So the House bill would reduce the scope of the conditions that could be imposed upon a rezoning, a conditional zoning case. In the event that the conditional zoning case being brought forth is for a project that includes a commitment for affordable housing. So if you include affordable housing, the City Council or Board of Commissioners would be limited to items like height and density. There are a few other items, but no other conditions could be imposed. And sometimes those list of conditions to reach an agreeable rezoning can get quite lengthy and creative, but that would be, that's an item being proposed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Any other business? Not hearing any. The floor is open for a motion for adjournment. There's a motion. Is there a second?
I second.
All those in favor, please give out an aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Once again, it is unanimous. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for attending and putting in time and effort.